Dr. Marcus Wells was the embodiment of professionalism and compassion at St. Mary's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. At 36, he had earned the respect and admiration of his colleagues and patients alike. Tall and poised, with a calm demeanor, Marcus had overcome significant challenges to become one of the leading cardiologists in the city. Every day, Marcus arrived at the hospital early, greeted by nurses and doctors who relied on his expertise. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, always putting patient care first. The morning rounds were a familiar routine, and today was no different. Marcus walked down the bright, sterile halls of the hospital, checking patient charts, offering advice to residents, and ensuring that everyone was receiving the best possible care. "Good morning, Dr. Wells," a young nurse, Hannah, greeted him as she handed over the day's list of patients. "Good morning, Hannah. How are we looking today?" Marcus asked, his eyes scanning the list. "Busy, as usual. But nothing you can't handle," she replied with a smile. Marcus nodded and continued his rounds, stopping at each patient's room to check on their progress. He always made it a point to talk to each patient, not just about their health but about their lives outside the hospital. He believed that healing was more than just medical treatment, it was about human connection. As he entered the room of Mrs. Parker, an elderly woman recovering from surgery, he smiled warmly. "How are we feeling today, Mrs. Parker?" Marcus asked, his voice soothing. "Oh, Dr. Wells, much better, thanks to you. I was telling my daughter just yesterday that I've never felt so well taken care of," she said, her gratitude shining through. "It's my pleasure. We'll get you back on your feet in no time," Marcus replied, adjusting her medication drip. His days were often filled with moments like these: gratitude, recovery, and the satisfaction of knowing he was making a difference. But Boston wasn't always kind, and neither were some of its people. After finishing his rounds, Marcus headed to his office for a brief moment of quiet before his next appointments. He was thinking about his journey, how far he'd come from his humble beginnings. The sacrifices his mother had made for him to go to medical school, the challenges of being a black man in a predominantly white medical field, and the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, racism he had encountered along the way. Just then, there was a knock on the door. "Come in," Marcus called, looking up from his desk. His colleague, Dr. Laura Benson, stepped in. "Marcus, I just wanted to say, your work on Mr. Harrison's case has been outstanding. That man is a handful, but you've handled him better than anyone else could," she said with genuine admiration. "Thanks, Laura. It's not always easy, but I try to focus on the patient, not the attitude," Marcus replied, grateful for the acknowledgement. "Well, keep it up. You're doing more than just medicine here," she said before leaving him to his thoughts. As Marcus sat back in his chair, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in his work. But something in the pit of his stomach told him that the road ahead would not always be smooth. He had faced challenges before, but what was coming would test him in ways he had never imagined. Boston was a city of opportunity, but also one of deep-seated prejudices, and Marcus was about to face them head-on. William Harrison was the kind of man who made everyone in the room uncomfortable. At 52, he was a prominent figure in Boston's business world, known for his wealth and influence, but also for his arrogance. He walked into St. Mary's Hospital like he owned the place, expecting nothing short of perfection. His cold blue eyes scanned every corner of the room as if he were inspecting a building he'd just purchased. When Dr. Marcus Wells was assigned to be his physician, the tension was palpable from the first moment they met. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," Marcus said, entering the private room with his usual calm. "I'm Dr. Wells, and I'll be overseeing your care while you're with us." Harrison glanced up from his phone, his expression tightening as he took in the sight of Marcus. There was a long pause before he finally spoke. "Dr. Wells, huh?" His tone was clipped, as if he was testing the name. "Well, I hope you know what you're doing. I'm not here to be anyone's experiment." Marcus, used to these kinds of insinuations, remained professional. I assure you, Mr. Harrison, you're in good hands. I've reviewed your charts, and will be working closely to manage your condition. Harrison leaned back in his bed, giving Marcus a once-over. I've had the best doctors in this city, Harvard graduates, the lot of them. I don't expect anything less from you. Marcus suppressed the urge to sigh. I trained at Harvard as well, Mr. Harrison. My focus will be on making sure you receive the best care possible, just as I would for any of my patients. The conversation ended there, with Harrison turning his attention back to his phone, clearly uninterested in anything further Marcus had to say. Marcus quietly left the room, feeling the weight of Harrison's unspoken judgment heavy on his shoulders. Outside, Nurse Hannah caught his eye as he walked by. She gave him a sympathetic smile. That man's a handful, isn't he? She said softly. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. I've dealt with worse. He's just difficult. But we're not here to be liked, right? Hannah nodded. True, but sometimes it wouldn't hurt if they were a little nicer. Marcus gave her a reassuring nod and continued down the hallway. But despite his calm exterior, Harrison's attitude gnawed at him. It wasn't the first time he'd faced prejudice in his career, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But something about this patient felt different. Harrison wasn't just difficult, he was dangerous in the way powerful men could be when they decided to make someone's life harder. Later that evening, as Marcus reviewed Harrison's test results in his office, Dr. Laura Benson stopped by. How's our star patient doing? She asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. He's complicated. Definitely not a fan of having me as his doctor. Laura raised an eyebrow. Let me guess, it's not because of your qualifications? Marcus smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. You could say that. But I'll get through to him. I always do. Just be careful, Laura said, her tone more serious now. Men like him, they have a way of making things difficult for people who don't fit their mold. You're good at what you do, Marcus, but don't let him push you too far. I won't, Marcus replied, though her words lingered with him long after she left. As the night wore on, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something about this case was going to test him more than he was prepared for. Harrison wasn't just a difficult patient, he was the kind of man who could ruin lives if he felt slighted. And Marcus, despite all his accomplishments and hard-earned respect, knew that in Harrison's eyes, he was just another doctor who didn't belong. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the storm began. Dr. Marcus Wells had just finished reviewing the results of William Harrison's latest tests and was preparing to discuss them with the difficult patient. The results were promising, Harrison's condition was stabilizing, and he was responding well to treatment. For a brief moment, Marcus felt a sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. But as he approached Harrison's room, he could sense the tension before even opening the door. A nurse hurried past him, her face pale and tight with worry. Dr. Wells, she whispered, barely meeting his gaze, Mr. Harrison, he's furious. He's accusing you of something. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Accusing me? Of what? The nurse swallowed hard. He says you stole something from him. Without waiting for more details, Marcus pushed open the door to Harrison's room. Inside, he found the man sitting upright in his bed, his face flushed with anger, his lawyer by his side. A hospital administrator stood near the window, looking deeply uncomfortable. All eyes turned to Marcus as he entered. What's going on here? Marcus asked, keeping his voice steady. Harrison's lawyer, a sharp-eyed man in an expensive suit, spoke first. Mr. Harrison claims that his Patek Philippe watch, a timepiece worth over $100,000, disappeared during your treatment session yesterday. He believes you stole it. Marcus froze for a second, disbelief washing over him. That's absurd. I would never. "Save your excuses," Harrison interrupted, his voice cold and dripping with accusation. "I know you took it. You were the only one near me during the procedure." Marcus stood tall, his heart pounding. "I was focused on treating your condition, Mr. Harrison, not on your watch. I didn't steal anything from you." The hospital administrator, Ms. Rodriguez, a woman Marcus had worked with for years, stepped in, her voice calm but firm. "Dr. Wells, we're going to conduct an internal investigation. Until we can resolve this matter, we'll need to follow protocol. You understand how serious this accusation is, don't you?" Marcus could barely believe what he was hearing. The weight of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about a watch. It was about his integrity, his career, everything he had worked for. "Of course, I understand," Marcus replied, keeping his composure. "But I didn't steal anything. This is a misunderstanding." Harrison scoffed. "A misunderstanding? My watch is gone, and you were the last person near me. You think I'm stupid?" "That's not what I'm saying," Marcus replied, his voice calm despite the tension in the room. "I'm saying I didn't take your watch. I was doing my job, trying to save your life." The lawyer interjected, his tone icy. "Regardless, Mr. Harrison is filing a formal complaint. The hospital will have no choice but to take this seriously. We'll be pursuing legal action as well." Marcus felt the walls closing in. He had dealt with prejudice before, but this felt different, more personal, more dangerous. His reputation, his career, everything he had built was suddenly at risk, all because of a baseless accusation. "I'm not guilty of what you're accusing me of," Marcus said, his voice firm. "And I will prove it." The room fell silent. Ms. Rodriguez nodded slowly, her face unreadable. "Dr. Wells, I'll be in touch with next steps. For now, please continue with your duties. But understand that we must treat this accusation seriously." Marcus nodded, but inside, he felt the weight of what was happening. As he left the room, Harrison's smug expression stayed with him, burning into his mind. This wasn't just about the watch, this was about something much deeper. Harrison didn't trust him, not because of anything Marcus had done, but because of who Marcus was. A black doctor treating a wealthy white man. As he walked down the hall, Marcus clenched his fists. He knew this was a battle he hadn't asked for, but it was one he had no choice but to fight. The news of William Harrison's accusation spread through St. Mary's Hospital like wildfire. Doctors whispered in the hallways, nurses exchanged uneasy glances, and even patients seemed to sense that something was off. Dr. Marcus Wells, once the respected and admired cardiologist, now walked through the hospital under a cloud of suspicion. As Marcus made his way to the staff lounge, he could feel the weight of every glance, every hushed conversation. He had worked so hard to earn the trust and respect of his peers, and now, with one baseless accusation, it felt like it could all be taken away. Inside the lounge, Dr. Laura Benson was waiting for him. She had heard the rumors, of course, everyone had. She stood up as he entered, her expression one of concern. "Marcus," she began carefully, "I heard about what happened with Harrison. Are you okay?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know, Laura. I didn't do anything, but it feels like half the hospital already thinks I'm guilty." Laura shook her head, stepping closer. "People talk, but the people who know you, really know you, understand this is ridiculous. You've always been one of the most ethical doctors here." Marcus appreciated her words, but they didn't lift the heavy feeling in his chest. "It's more than just gossip, Laura. This is Harrison we're talking about. He's a rich, powerful man, and his word carries weight. It doesn't matter that I didn't steal anything. People believe what they want to believe." Laura looked him straight in the eye, her voice soft but firm. "Then we'll fight this. We'll get to the truth, Marcus. You don't deserve this." Marcus nodded, though his mind was already racing. I just don't understand why he's doing this. What would he gain from accusing me of stealing a watch? It feels like he's trying to destroy me. Maybe it's not about the watch, Laura said quietly. Maybe it's about something else. You and I both know that people like Harrison see the world a certain way. You're not just his doctor, you're a black man who's in a position of authority. That's enough for him to feel threatened. Marcus exhaled slowly, knowing she was right. It's exhausting, Laura. I've worked my whole life to be the best at what I do, and yet, none of that matters to people like him. It does matter, she insisted. And we're going to make sure that the truth comes out. You're not alone in this. Just as Marcus was about to respond, there was a knock on the door. Ms. Rodriguez, the hospital administrator, stepped in. Her face was serious, but not unkind. Dr. Wells, can I have a word with you? She asked. Marcus exchanged a glance with Laura before following Ms. Rodriguez into the hallway. She led him to a small, quiet office where they could talk privately. Marcus, she began, using his first name in a rare moment of familiarity, I want you to know that we're taking this accusation very seriously. I've spoken with Mr. Harrison's legal team, and they're pushing for immediate action. Marcus's heart sank. Immediate action? What does that mean? Ms. Rodriguez sighed, her expression troubled. It means they're asking for your suspension while the investigation takes place. We can't ignore the legal pressure they're putting on us, especially given Mr. Harrison's influence. I don't want to do this, but my hands are tied. The weight of her words hit him like a blow. Suspension? His career, his reputation, all of it hanging by a thread because of one man's lie. This isn't fair, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't do anything wrong. I know, Marcus, Ms. Rodriguez replied, her tone genuinely sympathetic. But this is the procedure. We have to follow protocol. I promise, we'll do everything we can to clear your name as quickly as possible. Marcus clenched his fists, fighting the urge to scream. He had never felt so powerless, so trapped. How long will this investigation take? He asked, his voice tight. A few weeks, maybe more, Ms. Rodriguez answered. It depends on what the legal team uncovers. In the meantime, I need you to stay away from the hospital. Take some time off. Time off, Marcus echoed bitterly. Like that's going to help. Ms. Rodriguez gave him a small, sad smile. I'm sorry, Marcus. I really am. But I believe in you. We'll get to the bottom of this. As Marcus left the office, the weight of his suspension pressing down on him, he realized that this fight wasn't just about his career. It was about something much bigger. He wasn't just defending himself against a false accusation, he was standing up against a system that had always seen him as less, no matter how hard he worked or how much he achieved. And this time, he wouldn't go down without a fight. The days following Marcus's suspension were unbearable. The once busy routine of hospital rounds and patient care had been replaced by an agonizing silence. His phone remained largely quiet, except for the occasional call from his lawyer, Paul Jefferson, or from his close friend, Laura. Despite their assurances, Marcus felt as if the walls were closing in on him. The worst part wasn't even the accusation itself, it was the silence from his colleagues. Marcus had worked alongside many of them for years, yet now that he was facing this unfounded accusation, no one had reached out to support him publicly. It was as if they were all waiting to see which way the wind would blow before choosing a side. One afternoon, sitting in his small apartment, Marcus received a call from Paul. Marcus, how are you holding up? Paul asked, his voice calm but edged with concern. I'm trying, Marcus replied, rubbing his temples. But every day it gets harder. Have you found anything? Paul hesitated for a moment. We're working on it, but it's not easy. Harrison's legal team is pushing hard. They're pulling out all the stops, digging into your history, your finances, everything. Marcus gripped the phone tighter. What are they trying to prove? That I fit some stereotype? That I couldn't possibly have worked my way to where I am without cutting corners? I don't know their angle yet, but it's clear they're not just going after you because of the watch. This is about something more, something deeper. Marcus could feel the anger rising inside him. I've done everything right my whole life, Paul. I worked my way through med school, treated every patient with respect, no matter who they were. And now, one rich man's lie could ruin it all? Paul's voice softened. I know, Marcus. But we're going to fight this. I've already started gathering evidence. We need to prove that Harrison had a motive to accuse you, something other than the missing watch. And what about my colleagues? Has anyone from the hospital said anything? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Paul sighed. Not yet. No one's willing to speak out on your behalf, at least not publicly. Marcus leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of those words. He had given so much to the hospital, to his patients, and now, when he needed them most, they were silent. I'm not surprised, Marcus said quietly. People are afraid. It's easier to stand by and watch than to get involved. After the call, Marcus sat in silence, staring out the window at the city of Chicago, wondering how things had spiraled so quickly. He had always known that life as a black doctor in America came with challenges, but this was different. This felt like a betrayal on a level he hadn't expected. A few days later, as Marcus was sorting through his mail, he came across a letter with no return address. Curious, he opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message scrawled in messy handwriting. You don't belong here. Stay gone. Marcus stared at the letter, feeling the familiar mix of anger and fear rise within him. He had received racist threats before, but this one hit differently. Whoever had sent it wasn't just trying to intimidate him, they were warning him to stay away from the hospital for good. He knew he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. He couldn't back down, not now. But it was clear that this fight wasn't just about a false accusation, it was about who he was, and what he represented. And that meant the stakes were even higher than he'd imagined. Later that evening, Laura stopped by to check on him. She had been one of the few people to stay by his side through it all, offering support when others remained silent. Marcus, you don't look good, she said as she stepped inside his apartment. He forced a smile. I've been better. Laura sat down next to him. Listen, I've been thinking. There's something off about all of this. Harrison's accusations, the way the hospital is handling it, it feels orchestrated, like they're trying to get rid of you. Marcus looked at her, confused. Why would the hospital want to get rid of me? I've given them everything. Laura leaned forward, her voice low. It's not just about the hospital. Harrison has connections, powerful ones. You're a threat to them, Marcus. A black doctor who's excellent at his job, respected by patients, people like that don't sit well with certain people in power. Marcus frowned. So, what? They're using this accusation as an excuse to push me out? It's possible, Laura said. We need to dig deeper. We need to find out what's really going on behind the scenes. For the first time in days, Marcus felt a spark of hope. If there was more to this than just a stolen watch, maybe, just maybe, they could find the truth. I'll keep looking into it, Laura promised. We're not going to let them win. As she left, Marcus stood by the window, staring out at the city once again. He knew the fight ahead was going to be long and difficult. But now, with the support of those who truly believed in him, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The storm was far from over, but Marcus was ready to weather it. The sun had barely risen over Chicago when Marcus received an unexpected phone call from Paul. His lawyer's voice was firm, but there was a hint of urgency Marcus hadn't heard before. "Marcus, you need to come to the office now," Paul said without preamble. "What's going on?" Marcus asked, already sensing that something significant was unfolding. "I've uncovered something. You'll want to see this for yourself," Paul replied before hanging up. An hour later, Marcus was sitting across from Paul in his downtown office. Paul laid out a file filled with documents and photos, his expression grim. "I've been digging into Harrison's background," Paul began, leaning forward. "It wasn't easy, but I found something. Harrison's been involved in several lawsuits over the years, most of them buried deep in legal settlements. He has a history of false accusations, but here's the kicker: every single one of his targets was black." Marcus blinked, trying to process the information. "You're saying this isn't the first time he's done this?" Paul nodded. "Exactly. Harrison has a pattern of accusing successful black professionals of theft or fraud, and every time, he's managed to settle outside of court. He uses his wealth and influence to silence his victims." Marcus clenched his fists, his heart pounding. "Why hasn't this come to light before?" "Money," Paul said simply. "Harrison's lawyers are good at keeping things under wraps. They offer generous settlements, and most people take the deal rather than fight a lengthy legal battle. But this time, Marcus, you're not alone in this. We can expose him." Marcus sat back, the weight of Paul's words settling in. This wasn't just about him anymore. Harrison had a history of using his power to bring down people like him, people who had worked hard to build something for themselves. "We have to go public with this," Marcus said firmly. "If there's a pattern, people need to know." Paul raised an eyebrow. "Going public means risking everything. The hospital still hasn't made a statement, and if they side with Harrison, it could ruin your career." "I'm already at rock bottom, Paul," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "What more can they do to me? I won't let Harrison do this to anyone else." Paul nodded slowly. "All right, but we need to be strategic. If we go public, we'll need to build a case that's airtight. I'll reach out to some of Harrison's previous victims, see if they're willing to come forward." As they discussed their plan, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Laura. "You need to see this. Turn on the news." He grabbed the remote and switched on the TV in Paul's office. The screen flashed to a local news anchor, her face serious as she reported on a development in the case. "This morning, Dr. Marcus Thompson, the physician accused of stealing a patient's expensive watch, has become the subject of new allegations. Sources claim that this isn't the first time Dr. Thompson has been involved in questionable activities. Anonymous sources within the hospital suggest there have been multiple complaints over the years regarding Dr. Thompson's conduct." Marcus stared at the screen in disbelief. "They're turning this around on me," he muttered. Paul cursed under his breath. "This is Harrison's doing. He's planting rumors to smear your name even more." Marcus felt the walls closing in again. "What complaints? I've never had a single issue with my conduct." Paul leaned forward, his expression fierce. "They're fabricating this, Marcus. They're trying to discredit you before we can expose Harrison." Just then, Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time, it was from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Dr. Thompson?" The voice on the other end was shaky, nervous. "This is Marcus," he replied cautiously. "My name is Diane Mitchell. I used to work for Mr. Harrison. I heard what's happening, and I think I can help." Marcus exchanged a glance with Paul, who immediately grabbed a pen to take notes. "How can you help, Diane?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "I know about the watch," she said quietly. "I was with Mr. Harrison the day he said it went missing. He didn't lose it. He gave it to someone. I saw the whole thing." Paul's eyes widened as he scribbled furiously. "Are you willing to testify to that?" Marcus asked, his heart racing. Diane hesitated. I'm scared, Dr. Thompson. Mr. Harrison is a powerful man. But, he's hurt so many people. If you can protect me, I'll tell the truth. Paul jumped in. We'll protect you, Diane. Whatever it takes. Your testimony could be the key to bringing this whole thing down. After Diane hung up, Marcus sat back in his chair, a mix of relief and fear coursing through him. They finally had a witness, someone who could expose Harrison for the liar he was. But he knew this was only the beginning. We have to move fast, Paul said, already dialing numbers. Harrison's going to do everything in his power to keep her quiet. Marcus nodded, determination hardening in his chest. He had spent too long being silent, too long letting others dictate the course of his life. Now, it was time to fight back. The storm was coming, but Marcus was ready. The day of the hearing had finally arrived. Marcus sat in the cold, sterile hallway of the courthouse, his heart pounding. He could feel the tension in his muscles, every breath tight and deliberate. Laura sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm for comfort. You okay? She asked softly. Marcus nodded, but his mind was racing. Today was the day they would confront Harrison and his legal team. The evidence was mounting in Marcus's favor, but there was still so much at stake. His career, his reputation, and his dignity, all were on the line. Just then, Paul came striding down the hall toward them, a confident look on his face. We've got this, Marcus, Paul said firmly. Diane's ready to testify. And we've gathered enough evidence to show the pattern of accusations Harrison's made over the years. Marcus looked into Paul's eyes, searching for reassurance. Do you really think it's enough? It's more than enough, Paul replied. But be prepared for them to fight dirty. Harrison won't go down without a fight. Before Marcus could respond, the doors to the courtroom opened, and the bailiff called everyone in. Marcus stood up, straightened his tie, and took a deep breath. This was it. Inside the courtroom, Harrison sat at the plaintiff's table, his smug expression barely concealed. His lawyer, a tall man with a sharp, intimidating demeanor, stood at the ready, flipping through his notes. Marcus's eyes met Harrison's for a brief moment, and the wealthy businessman gave him a small, mocking smile. Paul leaned over to Marcus as they took their seats. Ignore him. He's trying to get in your head. The judge, a stern woman with gray hair pulled back into a tight bun, entered the room, and the proceedings began. Harrison's lawyer was the first to speak, presenting his opening statement with a practiced confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a clear case of theft. My client, Mr. Harrison, entrusted his personal belongings to Dr. Thompson's care while receiving medical treatment. Imagine his shock and dismay when he discovered that a valuable watch, an heirloom, had disappeared under Dr. Thompson's watch. The lawyer paused for effect, letting his words sink in before continuing. We will provide evidence and witness testimony that not only proves Dr. Thompson's guilt but also reveals a troubling pattern of behavior. This isn't an isolated incident, Your Honor. Dr. Thompson has a history of misconduct that we will bring to light. Marcus felt a surge of anger rise within him. It was all lies, but the lawyer's smooth delivery made it sound so convincing. He glanced over at Paul, who remained calm, waiting for his turn. When it was Paul's time to speak, he stood up slowly, walking toward the jury with a measured confidence. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here is not a case of theft. What we have is a case of prejudice. A man who is wealthy, powerful, and used to getting his way has accused a hardworking, respected doctor of stealing because, in his mind, Dr. Thompson didn't fit his idea of what a successful physician should look like. Paul's voice was steady but passionate as he continued. We will prove today that Mr. Harrison has a history of making false accusations against black professionals. He uses his influence to bully and intimidate, expecting his money to silence those he targets. But not this time. Today, we will show you the truth. As Paul sat down, Marcus felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He was in good hands. The first witness called to the stand was Diane Mitchell. She walked in nervously, her hands shaking as she took the oath. Marcus watched her closely, knowing that her testimony could be the turning point. "Ms. Mitchell, you worked for Mr. Harrison, is that correct?" Paul began. "Yes," Diane replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And on the day in question, you were present when Mr. Harrison claimed his watch went missing?" Diane nodded. "I was." Paul moved closer, his tone gentle. "Could you please tell the court what you saw that day?" Diane swallowed hard, glancing nervously at Harrison, who glared at her from his seat. I saw Mr. Harrison give the watch to someone," she finally said. "He didn't lose it. He gave it away." There was a murmur in the courtroom as the revelation sunk in. Marcus felt his heart leap in his chest. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Harrison's lawyer immediately stood up, objecting, but the judge overruled him. Diane's testimony continued, and with each word, the truth of Harrison's deceit became clearer. By the time Paul had finished his cross-examination, the tide had shifted. The once confident Harrison now looked unsettled, his smug demeanor faltering. When it was time for Marcus to take the stand, he walked up with his head held high, determined to speak his truth. "Dr. Thompson," Paul began, "can you tell us how these accusations have affected you?" Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts before answering. "It's been devastating. My career, my reputation, everything I've worked for, was called into question because of a lie. I've spent my life helping people, saving lives. To be accused of something like this, it's beyond hurtful. It's about more than just a watch. It's about prejudice, about being judged not by the work I've done, but by the color of my skin." His voice broke slightly, but he kept his composure, determined not to let his emotions overwhelm him. "All I want is for the truth to come out. I didn't steal anything. I've never stolen anything in my life." As Marcus left the stand, the courtroom was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The hearing continued with more testimonies, each one chipping away at Harrison's fabricated story. By the end of the day, it was clear that Marcus had the truth on his side. As they left the courtroom, Paul turned to Marcus with a rare smile. "We've got him." Marcus exhaled slowly, the tension that had been building for months finally beginning to ease. But he knew it wasn't over yet. The trial would continue, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt hope. The truth was finally coming to light. The courtroom felt heavier than ever as the trial entered its final stages. Marcus sat quietly, trying to focus on his breathing as he waited for the next round of testimonies. The tension was palpable, and although things were slowly turning in his favor, the emotional weight was becoming almost unbearable. Laura leaned over to him, her voice low but steady. "Marcus, you've come this far. Don't lose faith now." "I'm not," Marcus replied, but there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed his calm facade. "It's just, how much longer? How much more do I have to go through before people start believing me?" Paul, standing beside them, glanced over. "Today is a big day. Harrison's personal assistant is testifying, and if we're right, she's going to confirm everything Diane said. This could seal the deal." Marcus nodded, but doubt still lingered in his mind. He had already been through so much, and even with the truth on his side, he wasn't sure if that would be enough to overcome the prejudice that had clouded everyone's judgment from the start. The courtroom doors swung open, and the bailiff called everyone back inside. Marcus rose slowly, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He exchanged a brief glance with Harrison, whose composure had begun to crumble in recent days. Gone was the smug, arrogant businessman who had confidently hurled baseless accusations. In his place sat a man who now looked uncertain, perhaps even fearful. Court is now in session, the judge announced, her gavel striking sharply against the wooden podium. Paul stood, his presence commanding the room as he prepared to call the next witness. The defense calls Margaret Whitmore to the stand. Margaret, Harrison's longtime assistant, made her way to the front of the room. She appeared nervous, her hands clasped tightly together as she took the oath. Marcus watched her carefully. This was it. She held the key to unraveling everything. Ms. Whitmore, Paul began, his voice calm but firm, how long have you worked for Mr. Harrison? 10 years, Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. And in that time, have you ever known him to make false claims or accusations? There was a pause. Margaret's eyes flickered toward Harrison, who sat glaring at her, his expression darkening. She took a deep breath before answering. Yes, she said, her voice shaking slightly. On more than one occasion. There was a ripple of surprise through the courtroom. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, hope surging within him. This was what they had been waiting for. Paul nodded, giving her the space to gather her thoughts before continuing. Can you tell us about the day of the alleged theft? What did you witness? Margaret hesitated again, clearly torn between her loyalty to her employer and the truth she knew she had to reveal. Finally, she spoke. I saw Mr. Harrison give his watch to someone else that day. It wasn't stolen by Dr. Thompson, she admitted, her voice steadier now. He wanted to frame Dr. Thompson. He thought no one would believe a black doctor over him. Marcus's heart stopped for a moment. The words hung in the air, undeniable and cutting. There it was, Harrison's deceit laid bare for everyone to hear. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the truth too powerful to ignore. Harrison's lawyer immediately stood to object, but the damage had already been done. The truth was out. Marcus glanced over at Paul, who gave him a small nod of reassurance. They were winning, but the battle wasn't over yet. As the judge called for order, Paul seized the opportunity to continue questioning. Ms. Whitmore, why do you think Mr. Harrison made these accusations against Dr. Thompson? Margaret hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable. But after a long pause, she answered. Because he didn't like that Dr. Thompson was a successful black man. He felt threatened, and he thought accusing him of theft would ruin his reputation. Harrison's face turned a deep shade of red as the courtroom buzzed with shock. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, no longer able to maintain his facade of superiority. Marcus sat silently, absorbing the weight of Margaret's words. The truth was finally out in the open, and the tide had fully turned in his favor. But the emotional toll of the entire ordeal had left him exhausted. After Margaret stepped down from the witness stand, Paul turned to Marcus. We're almost there, Marcus. Just a little longer. Marcus nodded, his eyes focused on Harrison. The man who had tried to destroy him now sat exposed, his lies unraveling in front of everyone. As the judge called for a recess, Marcus stepped outside with Laura. He leaned against the wall, his hands shaking slightly. It's almost over, Laura said softly, placing a hand on his arm. Yeah, Marcus whispered, but it's been too much. All of this, just because of the color of my skin. I knew prejudice was still out there, but I didn't expect it to hit me like this. Laura squeezed his arm gently. You're strong, Marcus. And you're almost at the finish line. Don't let him take anything more from you. Marcus nodded, though the weight of everything still hung heavy on his heart. It wasn't just about winning the case anymore. It was about the deeper truth, the harsh reality of how easily a man like Harrison could try to destroy someone based on nothing more than his own bigotry. As they walked back into the courtroom, Marcus felt a renewed sense of determination. The truth had been revealed, and soon, justice would be served. The courtroom was silent as the final day of the trial began. Marcus sat beside Paul, his attorney, while Laura gave him a reassuring glance. The weight of the last few months hung heavy in the air, but today was different. There was a sense of finality, an understanding that everything would soon be decided. As the judge entered the room and called for order, Marcus could feel his heart pounding. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment where the truth would either set him free or leave him shattered. The prosecutor rose, turning to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard the testimony. Mr. Harrison, a respected businessman, claims that Dr. Marcus Thompson, a man who took an oath to save lives, stole from him. The question before you is simple: who do you believe? A man of wealth and reputation? Or a man whose integrity has been called into question simply because he had the audacity to be successful while black?" Marcus clenched his fists under the table. He had heard these kinds of arguments his whole life, subtle, insidious, making it seem like race was never mentioned but always the unspoken truth behind the words. Paul stood to address the jury, his voice calm but impassioned. "What we are dealing with today is not just about whether or not a watch was stolen. This case represents something bigger, an accusation built on prejudice and fear. Mr. Harrison believed that by accusing Dr. Thompson, his wealth and influence would protect him. But today, we ask you to see through that facade. Dr. Thompson is not guilty of any crime, other than being too successful for someone like Mr. Harrison to tolerate." As Paul sat down, the tension in the room grew even thicker. The judge called for a brief recess before the jury was sent to deliberate. Marcus stood slowly, taking a deep breath. "How are you holding up?" Laura asked, stepping beside him. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice betrayed the nerve still rattling him inside. "I just want this to be over." "It will be," Paul said, joining them. "You've done everything you can. Now it's in their hands." Marcus nodded, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He couldn't help but think of all the lives he had saved, all the years of hard work he had put into becoming the doctor he was today. And yet here he was, his entire life's work nearly destroyed because of one man's prejudice. "I just keep thinking," Marcus began, his voice low, "about how different this could have been if I wasn't black. If I wasn't the target of his hatred. Would we even be here?" Laura placed a hand on his shoulder. "But you are here. And you've fought back with dignity. No matter what happens, you stood your ground." Paul checked his watch. "They'll call us back in soon. Try to stay focused. No matter what happens, we'll keep fighting if we need to." Marcus nodded again, but the weight of everything felt overwhelming. He had gone from a respected doctor to a man on trial for a crime he didn't commit, all because someone couldn't accept him for who he was. When the courtroom doors reopened, Marcus walked back in with Laura and Paul by his side. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The judge took her seat, and the silence in the room grew unbearable. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreperson stood, holding the small piece of paper that would determine Marcus's future. "We have, Your Honor." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as the judge nodded for them to proceed. "We find the defendant, Dr. Marcus Thompson, not guilty." A rush of relief flooded through Marcus as the words sank in. The tension that had gripped him for so long began to melt away. He turned to Paul, who gave him a small smile, then to Laura, whose eyes filled with tears of joy. "You did it," she whispered. Marcus let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "We did it." The judge thanked the jury and dismissed the court, but Marcus barely heard any of it. All he could focus on was the overwhelming sense of freedom, of justice finally being served. He had won, not just the trial, but his dignity back. As they left the courtroom, Marcus paused outside the courthouse. The sun was shining, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt hopeful. "I knew the truth would come out," Laura said, standing beside him. Marcus looked at her and then at Paul, feeling a deep gratitude for their support throughout the ordeal. "I just didn't know it would be this hard." Paul gave him a reassuring smile. The fight for justice is always hard. But today, you proved something important. You didn't let him destroy you. Marcus nodded. No, I didn't. And with that, they walked away from the courthouse, the weight of the past few months finally lifting off Marcus's shoulders. But even as they left the trial behind, Marcus knew that the battle against prejudice wasn't over. It never was. But for now, he had won, and that was enough. The morning after the trial was a mix of relief and reflection for Marcus Thompson. He sat in his modest apartment, the city skyline visible through the window, and looked out at the bustling streets below. It was a new day, one he had fought hard to see, but it felt surreal. Laura knocked lightly on the door before entering, carrying a box of Marcus's favorite coffee and a warm smile. "I thought you might need a pick-me-up," she said, setting the box down on the table. Marcus looked up, his face softening at the sight of his friend. "Thanks, Laura. I don't know what I would have done without you." She waved off his gratitude with a casual gesture. "You would have made it through, Marcus. You're stronger than you think." Paul entered right behind her, carrying a stack of papers. "Morning. I've got the final paperwork for you to review. It's mostly formalities, but it's all part of officially closing the case." Marcus took the papers and began flipping through them, but his mind kept drifting back to the trial and the whirlwind of emotions that had come with it. It's hard to believe it's all over. It feels like a lifetime ago that this started. "It does feel like that, doesn't it?" Paul said, taking a seat across from Marcus. "But remember, what you went through has made a difference. It's not just about clearing your name, it's about setting a precedent." Laura poured coffee into 3 mugs, handing one to each of them. "I still can't believe how fast everything turned around once Margaret testified." Marcus took a sip, savoring the familiar taste. "I never doubted her, but I didn't expect the jury to come back so quickly. It was like a weight lifted off my shoulders." Paul nodded, looking thoughtful. "It's amazing how the truth can shine through when given the chance. But remember, while this chapter is closing, there's a lot more work to be done in fighting prejudice and injustice." Marcus sighed, setting his mug down. "I know. I've been thinking about that a lot. This case has shown me how deep the issues run and how important it is to keep speaking out." Laura reached over, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "You've already started making a difference. Maybe now you can use your experience to help others who are facing similar battles." A moment of silence fell over the room as Marcus considered Laura's words. The trial had been a fight for his own dignity, but it had also opened his eyes to the larger issues of systemic racism and inequality. He knew he wanted to continue making an impact, using his voice and his position to advocate for change. Paul broke the silence with a smile. "So, what's next for Dr. Marcus Thompson? Any plans to take on the world or just enjoy some well-deserved peace?" Marcus chuckled, the tension of the past months easing. "I think I'll start by taking a break. But I do want to get involved in some community outreach. Maybe work with organizations that help fight against racial injustice." Laura grinned. "That sounds like a great plan. And I'm sure whatever you do next will be impactful." Paul stood up, gathering the paperwork. "I'll leave you to enjoy your coffee and relax for a bit. Just remember, if you need anything, we're here for you." Marcus smiled, his gratitude evident. "Thanks, Paul. And thank you both for everything. I couldn't have done this without your support." As Paul and Laura left, Marcus sat quietly, reflecting on the journey he had been through. The trial had been grueling, but it had also brought him closer to understanding his own strength and the power of standing up against injustice. He glanced out the window once more, watching the city go about its daily routine. It was a new beginning, and although the fight for justice was far from over, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. With a deep breath, he took a final sip of his coffee and started making plans for the future. The battle had been tough, but now it was time to use his experience to help others and continue the fight for a more just world.